We want to turn now to the President's State of the Union speech on Tuesday, and we're going to Houston and the Tea Party Republican Ted Cruz, who led the shutdown of the government last fall because the president wouldn't agree to shut down Obamacare. Senator, thank you for coming. You have already released a list of issues you want the president to address in his State of the Union speech, including you want a new investigation into the Benghazi controversy and into the IRS. You want him to admit that his economic program has failed, that it was a mistake to pass Obamacare on a party line vote. Senator, that sounds like you want a confession, not a speech.
Well, what I put out are the questions that I'm hearing from Texans all over the state. I spent a lot of time traveling the state of Texas, listening to Texans, and the questions they raise over and over again, they say, why are jobs and economic growth so dismal? We've got the lowest labor force participation in over 3 decades, since 1978. And if President Obama wants to give an honest, candid State of the Union address this week, he'll address the fact that his economic policies are not working and that they're exacerbating income inequality. They're hurting the people who are struggling the most. Each of the questions I put up are questions that the people are asking. Now, I think the odds that the president will answer them are not high, but it's what he should if he was listening to the concerns the people are raising.
Well, of course, what he would say is that he is creating more jobs, that unemployment is going down and on, but we'll leave that for the Democrats to talk about. Let me ask you this. You became a celebrity when you led the drive to shut down the government over Obamacare, but afterward, your fellow Republicans said you led them over a cliff. Can you conceive of any situation in which you would do that again, try to shut down the government in exchange or in demand for some action by the president?
Well, Bob, with all due respect, I don't agree with the premise of your question. Throughout the government shutdown, I opposed a government shutdown. I said we shouldn't shut the government down. I think it was a mistake that President Obama and the Democrats shut the government down this fall. The reason they did so is that President Obama dug in and said he wouldn't compromise, he wouldn't negotiate. In fact, I went to one of the most surreal meetings I've ever been at, where President Obama invited all the Senate Republicans to go up to the White House. He sat us in a room. This is in the middle of the shutdown, and he said, I invited you here to tell you I will not negotiate, I will not compromise on anything. That's why we had a shutdown. That was a mistake. But, you know, in terms of whether we should have stood and fought on Obamacare, I think the proof is in the pudding. Millions of people across the country have seen now why we were standing and fighting, because Obamacare is a disaster. And you know, for the State of the Union, one of the things President Obama really ought to do is look in the TV camera and say to the over 5 million Americans all across this country who've had their health insurance canceled because of Obamacare, to look in the camera and say, I'm sorry. I told you if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep it. I told you if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. And that wasn't true. I'm sorry. But then, Bob, here's the real kicker. If you're really sorry, you don't just say you're sorry, you actually do something to fix the problem. The pattern we've seen over and over again with this president is he says he's sorry, he expresses outrage, but then he doesn't fix the problem. He keeps doing it over and over again.
All right, let me go back to one thing, and the question I asked you was, would you ever conceive of threatening to shut down the government again?
Well, as I said, I didn't threaten to shut down the government the last time. I don't think we should ever shut down the government. I repeatedly voted to fund the federal government.
Senator, if you didn't threaten to shut down the government, who was it that did? I mean, but we'll go on to something else.
It was Harry Reid and President Obama. But Bob, look, I understand that the White House said over and over again the shutdown is the Republicans' fault, and I understand that's what you're repeating. But the reality is, I voted over and over again to fund the federal government, and the reason we had a shutdown. Look, the Democrats were very candid. I know they told you, they said, we think the shutdown benefits us politically. Right now, the Democrats are telling you that they want another shutdown because they think it benefits them politically. Why is it hard to understand that they force a shutdown when they think it benefits them politically?
Senator, I know what Republicans were telling me, like John Boehner, who said this was a disaster and never again. But let me ask you one more question here. The government is approaching another. Well, now just a minute. Just a minute. The government is approaching another deadline, February 7th, when it will run out of money unless Congress agrees to raise the debt ceiling. Will you agree to raise the debt ceiling, or will you demand something in return?
Look, of course we should do something. We shouldn't just write a blank check. 5 years ago, the national debt was $10 trillion. That took 43 presidents over 200 years to build up $10 trillion in debt. Today, it's over $17 trillion. It's grown nearly 70% with one president in 5 years. And if you ask any American outside of Washington, should we just keep raising the debt ceiling while doing nothing to have fundamental structural controls on spending to get Washington's spending problem under control? It doesn't matter if you're talking to a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, a libertarian. Anyone outside of Washington says, of course. And it's worth noting, in the past, the debt ceiling has been the most effective lever point for real structural reforms, whether it was Graham Rudman, which did a great job of restricting government spending, getting it under control, or whether it was the Budget Control Act. Both of those came through the debt ceiling. And what the president is saying is he just wants a blank credit card to keep growing and growing the debt. And I think that's irresponsible. I think it's irresponsible to our kids and grandkids to stick that debt on them because we can't live within our means.
Let me ask you something on a different subject. Do you think Chris Christie is still a viable candidate for the Republican nomination?
You know, Bob, I like Chris Christie. I think he is brash and outspoken, and I think it's terrific that he's been able to get elected twice as a Republican in a very blue state. I think it's unfortunate he's found himself in this mess, and I hope he can extricate himself. I'm certainly rooting for him to do so because I think he's an effective leader, and I'd like to see him move on to governing New Jersey and not being mired in the scandal.
Will you run for president?
Well, look, my focus is on the challenges facing this country right now. It's on the Senate. My focus, for example, is on the abuse of power from the president. Let's take something like the IRS scandal.
So do I take that as a yes or a no? Or still thinking about it?
What you can take that as is that my focus is standing and fighting right now in the Senate to bring back jobs and economic growth. Economic growth is my #1 priority.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you again.
Thank you, Bob.